Section 4, The Paradigm of Modern Science. In this section, we'll be discussing what I believe to be the most important foundations of the scientific worldview. Put simply, an exploration of how your average scientist thinks, or in the very least, how they're expected to think, about the reality we occupy. For our critique of science to hold any water, it's important that we first understand how it got to where it is today, and this is largely due to the philosophies that are held by its constituents. Let's first go over what a paradigm is, and then we can determine the paradigm that modern science holds to. This is actually a Greek loanword which means example, model, or pattern, and can be literally translated as show side by side, from para meaning beside and tessere meaning to show. But nowadays we use it to be somewhat synonymous with a worldview, a collection of concepts and assumptions about one's reality and their place in it. A sort of lens through which we filter our experience of objects and events through. Alternatively, people might hold a more specific paradigm around certain subjects. For example, a dietary and nutritional paradigm, such as vegetarianism, veganism, halal, carnivore, and numerous others. There is something we all have in one form or another, since humans are meaning makers and are constantly, whether we want to or not, building models for how to interpret our reality. This in and of itself isn't really an issue, but it can become problematic when people refuse to criticize and question their own paradigms in light of counterarguments. This refusal to entertain the belief that a paradigm might be incorrect is called dogmatism, and is in my view the biggest problem facing humanity today and throughout our history. We'll be coming back to why that is shortly. Anyway, a more systematic way of defining a paradigm is to look at it as a combination of two separate philosophical positions that a person takes, their ontological position and their epistemological position. The former position is a fancy way of saying, what does someone believe? And the latter is a way of saying, why does someone believe what they believe? Thus, a worldview can be even more simply summed up as a way of answering the question, what do you believe and why? But if individuals can have a paradigm, does that mean that a collective institution, such as the scientific establishment, can have one? In my view, the answer is yes, absolutely. In the same way that a religious body or political activism group can have a paradigm that is shared amongst their adherents, so too can this one. There are a definite set of assumptions expressed and shared by the majority of scientists, and although there are shifts beginning to occur within the halls of laboratories and academia, this doesn't mean these assumptions are going away anytime soon in large part. Throughout modern history, science as a whole has held to the ontological position of materialism and the epistemological position of positivism. Thus, moving forward, we can refer to their worldview as the Materialist-Positivist Paradigm, or MPP for short. Obviously then, we need to next define what materialism and positivism are. Materialism is the belief that the physical universe, that which can be seen, felt, or otherwise detected by the senses, is the only reality in existence, or at least the only one that we should be concerning ourselves with. Note that this is different from the more colloquial use of the word pertaining to people who have a shallow obsession with physical possessions and outward displays of wealth and social status. It's not the same thing. As you may know, the physical stuff of our world, its substance, is scientifically referred to as matter, which shares a very obvious root with the word material, and thus materialism. Generally speaking, materialists will argue that the universe can be likened to a mechanism, or machine, which can be fully understood by way of breaking it down into its constituent parts, studying those parts, and concluding that this information is really all that's needed to gain a view of the inner workings of nature. For more on the specifics of these arguments, I would recommend looking into the well-known English philosopher John Locke, who's often credited with laying the modern foundations of this ontology. To help put things into perspective, an opposing ontological position sometimes taken up by philosophers is that of idealism, which can be perhaps better rendered in modern English as ideaism. This is an enormous topic to take up, but to put it as succinctly as possible, it's a position that asserts that the mind and consciousness are the ground of reality, and that the physical world is merely a reflection of our thinking, in other words, our ideas about it. Basically, we're all working together to sort of dream the physical universe into existence. This ontology has become so entangled with modern scientific thinking that to some people, including many scientists themselves, they're practically synonymous. It's actually pretty common on university campuses to hear someone state that some claim is unscientific, when in fact it's more accurate for them to say that the claim is unmaterialistic, if that's a word. But to better understand why the scientific community has elected to take up materialism rather than idealism or any other position, we need to look at their epistemology, which is a bit more involved. Positivism is the epistemological position largely held by the scientific community. It states that knowledge is gained via empirical data, which is then filtered through the scientific method. This type of knowledge, in the lexicon of philosophy, is called positive knowledge, and is why we often say that we're positive about something that we feel quite sure is true. Now, this word empirical relates to information that we can sense directly through sight, touch, smell, taste, and/or hearing, although it now seems to extend to information that we can sense with instruments like microscopes, EMF readers, spectrometers, etc. Empiricism is another type of epistemology from which positivism evolved. Basically, positivism just adds another filter and says that any of this information that our senses tell us is true must be confirmed by analyzing it scientifically. In other words, our senses alone are not trustworthy enough. They need to be filtered through the scientific method. Positivists also tend to reject the notion that knowledge can be obtained through methods such as instinct or intuition, and usually assume that all humans are mentally blank slates or tabula rasa upon birth, and that all behaviors, ideas, and moral principles are learned as we grow. So, they argue, because matter is all that can be directly sensed, it should be considered the basis for all of reality. It's the only thing there is, or at least the only thing worth considering, since everything else can't be proven empirically. This position is very likely why atheism and agnosticism are so highly correlated with people who consider themselves science enthusiasts. Since the concept of God, the soul, afterlife, etc. can't be sensed or tested scientifically, they're rejected outright. In the world of philosophical debate, positivism and empiricism are often countered by rationalism, which asserts that truth is better arrived at via reasoning things out, and as proponents would argue that our sensory perceptions are too limited and subjective to provide us with a reliable ground for reality. It's pretty common then for rationalism to pair itself with idealism, leading to what we could call the idealist-rationalist paradigm, which finds itself at odds with the worldview of the scientific community. So now that we've dissected these philosophies a bit, we can effectively summarize the past few slides by posing the paradigmatic position of the scientific community as being physical matter is the ground of all reality, and we know this because we can sense it and then test it using the scientific method. And this in itself is a perfectly fine modus operandi so long as its limits are admitted to by the scientists, and so long as it's acknowledged as simply a working framework to guide questions. But it can run into problems if and when it becomes a dogmatic stance against any other point of view. And scientists start claiming that any investigations into phenomena that don't use this as their philosophical foundation are inherently flawed, useless, or stupid. To finish off this section, I want to discuss one more ism that's downstream of the MPP, and is a model of the universe that's held in high regard by much of the scientific establishment, one that we can call Mechanistic Determinism or the machine metaphor, which considers everything in the universe to be nothing more than the results of a highly complex machine. In the same way that we could understand a car by understanding its parts, so too can the same be done with understanding the whole of the phenomenal world. This implies that the universe is also deterministic, and that if one gathers enough technical information about how things work, they could predict anything and everything that will happen. In this way, free will is an illusion, since our brains are just seen as a collection of specialized cells exchanging molecules and electrical impulses with one another. Every decision we make is just a mechanistic reaction to this or that stimuli. As we move through this module, and Lifeology as a whole, one of my primary goals will be to provide arguments for why such views are faulty, if only so that those listening might be given the opportunity to consider such a position that doesn't rely on religious faith or magical escapism. But to get there, you'll have to move on to the next section.